My name is Erik Swyngedouw. I'm a professor of human geography at University of Manchester and currently visiting a professor in political science at Sciences Po. I'm an engineer by training, but I discovered very early on that science and technology alone is not going to help save the world. So after my engineering studies, I became increasingly interested in social and political mobilizations around environmental issues. And I do still believe that today, given the environmental condition that we are in, that thinking through the environment politically rather than techno-managerially is the main issue, is the main concern, particularly in the context in which we are today, which is a strange condition, in many ways a paradoxical condition. On the one hand, everything is contested and contentious. Everything can be rendered contentious. Consider, for example, the argument over climate change, over biodiversity loss, over sustainability. You find a whole wide range of issues that are being debated at length, in which a whole wide range of different positionalities and visions are not only articulated, but actively invited in. On the other hand, we are being told time after time again that the political is disappearing. The most obvious example of that, of course, is that with every ritual of representative democratic elections, there are less and less people who express clearly an interest. So this is a very strange, paradoxical situation that on the one hand, everything seems to be discussable, can be rendered contentious. On the other hand, a number of people argue that we're living in highly depoliticized, or as I would call it together with others, post-geopolitical times, in which issues of concern, such as the climate, such as sustainability, such as biodiversity, are increasingly rendered techno-managerial. And here I think we have a possibility to begin to tease out this paradoxical situation in which we are, that on the one hand everything can be discussed on the one hand, on the other hand things, processes and conditions that are seen as problematic and that are consensually established as being problematic, that they should be dealt with and can only be dealt with through a series of techno-managerial dispositives. Now, I would argue that the increasing dominance of techno-managerial dispositives for the governing of consensually established concerns is one of the key vehicles, the key trajectories, the key means through which a process of depoliticization is being manufactured, maintained, and made more deeply entrenched. So this has all manner of consequences, particularly for the environmental condition. Take the example of climate change. The climate change has now been consensually and almost universally elevated to the dignity of a matter of global humanitarian concern. Everyone agrees with that diagnosis, that it is an issue. Those who still negate, deny that climate change is happening are now relegated to the margins of respectability. So now, despite the fact that we all agree that the situation is dramatic, it seems that no one is taking the situation seriously. Because despite its elevation to the level, to the dignity of a global concern, very little has actually happened. If you look at all the data about the buildup of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, they keep on going up. This year, just last week, I think, we in Europe have now joined the emblematic time of 400 ppm in the atmosphere. There is now 400 ppm of CO2 in the atmosphere, and that has become such a symbolic threshold precisely because it is the highest concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere that we know the Earth has ever had. This was about the concentration of greenhouse gases that was similar to the time when the dinosaurs were roaming Paris. And yet, despite this concern, very little is actually happening except for a series of techno-managerial configurations that proclaim to address that issue. Now, the particular framing of the techno-managerial dispositives developed to allegedly deal with this dramatic situation that we are in, or I would argue, primarily aimed at making sure that nothing really happens, and are therefore almost perfect example of the process of post-politicization. Take Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth. It gave Al Gore, together with the IPCC, the Nobel Peace Prize when the documentary and the book came out. And Gore was elevated to the dignity of a world climate hero, a warrior who was showing to all of us that it's not 5 before 12, but 5 past 12. That the situation is so dramatic that we have to take immediate and drastic action in order to stave off an apocalyptic future. Now, the question we have to ask ourselves here, what is Al Gore's social and political imaginary? I don't think he is the greatest political revolutionary. His main concern, as is the main concern of most of the global neoliberal elites, is to make sure that civilization, as he knows it, can continue for a bit longer. So the techno-managerial configuration that is being set up to mitigate your climate change is there precisely to make sure that politics is evacuated from the terrain of debate. And this brings, of course, the question of what politics is all about. But I assume we'll talk about that later. The very statement of bringing nature back into politics seems to suggest that nature resides a priori, or at least in the present condition, outside of politics. I dispute that. So what I would argue is that we indeed have to move from an emphasis on politics of the environment, that is, politicize the environment, to a condition of environmentalizing politics. And let me try to explain that for a moment. A few years ago, Slavoj Žižek controversially stated, nature does not exist. A few years after that, Alain Badiou, the French philosopher, stated equally controversially, ecology is the new opium for the people. I think both of these statements in their controversial statement should be taken seriously. When Žižek says nature does not exist, what does he mean? Of course, it does not mean that there is no mountains and DNA and elephants and earthquakes and supernovas in the solar system. What he does mean is that nature as a practice, category, and set of processes that exist outside of the social is just not there. Yet, by insisting, as in modernity we have almost systematically done, that there is something outside of the social which can be isolated from it, is precisely one of the tactics and mechanisms through which nature has become depoliticized. And has become depoliticized in very precise ways. That is, the way in which we have constructed nature does not mean that it does not have any political or cultural force. Nature in its construction is extremely performative. We invoke nature in a variety of ways. First of all, we homogenize it, nature, and by doing so, we disavow the radical heterogeneity of the heterogeneous physical, biological, chemical, and other processes that constitute the non-human world. A. B. Through this metonymic sequencing that gives some sort of content to nature, we also inscribe in nature a sort of ontological status that we can invoke in order to legitimize action. For example, heterosexuality is often normatively legitimized on the basis of invoking nature. Or, for example, the greed, competition, etc., is often invoked in terms of situating it into a kind of extra-human nature. It is in the nature of things. So this extraordinarily performative way through which nature as an external object works politically in depoliticizing ways. We also invoke today nature as a basis of doing politics. Think of the climate change argument, whereby the standard argument is climate change is happening. It is at least in part the result of human intervention, the buildup of atmospheric greenhouse gases. And what we have to do is to bring nature back to some sort of, or the climate back to some sort of ideal moment. Actually, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is very precise on what the good climate was. It was 1989. I don't know whether you remember 1989, but I do. It was a horrible year. Millions of people died of hunger, drought, ecological conditions, etc. Yet, the climatological conditions of 1989 are considered to be fine. So if you were to be able to go back to re-engineer, this is what the climate change argument is, that we have to re-engineer to a whole set of techno-managerial dispositives the climate such that the conditions mimic those that we had 30 or 40 years ago, everything will be fine. Now that's a purely ideological way of invoking nature as a legitimacy for particular political interventions. I think that has to be abandoned completely. And we have to fully endorse, that there is no such thing as nature outside of the human any longer. And it's precisely such tactic that necessitates rendering nature political. Let me exemplify that. You know that it is among geophysicists an argument about whether or not we, the world, humanity, has entered a new geological era called the Anthropocene. It's a very contested concept. In fact, the geologists have not yet officially agreed whether we should accept the Anthropocene as a new geological period. Hopefully that will happen in 2016. Why this concern? Why this concern? And for me, the whole issue revolves precisely about the political and scientific implications of accepting the notion of the Anthropocene, which basically means that the future of the Earth in its very physical acting, in its long and deep geological time, is very deeply implicated with the humans. We humans are an active force in shaping the very physical conditions of the Earth in its totality. If that is accepted, then natural scientists cannot any longer condescendingly leave social and political matters to the humanities and the social sciences, and vice versa. The humanities and social sciences cannot any longer pretend that they can say something political or cultural or social about the human world without explicitly taking into account the material conditions and futures that are articulated with these social, cultural, or economic processes. So the very notion of the Anthropocene opens up the necessity of politicizing nature again. And what I mean then by politicizing nature is, of course, nothing else than the contested but very active procedure of social and political conflict over the production of the socio-physical environment, the socio-physical assemblages that constitute life. So for me, politics is not just the domain of contentious issues. This is the sort of liberal notion of politics, which understands the world as composed of a heterogeneous configurations of different positionalities in which different individuals and social groups take different positionalities, and as a result of that have different visions and ideas about the world. And as long they are made visible and become articulated, hopefully in an idealized open public space a la Habermas, that is politics. For me, that's not good enough. This is only one way of understanding what the political is all about. For me, the political is the name that stands for the radical heterogeneity that cuts through the social. For me, therefore, the political announces itself as a moment of interruption in the given configuration that in its interrupting acting prefigures already new ways of organizing socio-physical relationships. And it's precisely these moments of politicized prefiguring of a different world within the world which radically breaks with traditional notion of politics. So for me, the political is quite literally the emergence in the world, however embryonic it might be in its emergence, the emergence of a different world in the world that leads to two worlds in the world, and where consequently a long, if successful, a long and difficult process unfolds of constructing a new world that renders the old world obsolete. Let me give you a concrete example of that, not from the environmental domain, but I'm sure you recall Rosa Parks, the African-American woman who in 1955-56 entered the bus and sat down on the wrong seat. That for me is a political interruption, because in doing so, she simultaneously did two things. That is, by acting in the particular way she did, she exposed a wrong in a given order that is nonetheless based on the presumption of equality. The American Constitution is one that enshrines equality in its very basic formulation. Rosa Parks, by sitting herself down, made visible, made public, the inegalitarian wrong that was expressed in the everyday organization of racist America. And in doing so, she also performatively staged equality. So it's in the political act that for me, both the inegalitarian order of the given situation is made visible, and where in the very act equality and therefore emancipation becomes prefigured. It is precisely such politicizing interventions that today have become extremely difficult and very often subject to violence. Consider climate change, to bring it back to the environment. we've seen a whole sequence of what I would call your climate carnivals. I forgot at what number we are, COP16, COP17, soon COP20 in Paris. Yes, soon we have COP20 in Paris. Yet another sort of festival. It's like the football World Cup today. And the parallels are actually quite interesting. As we know today in Sao Paulo, people are protesting in the streets against this neoliberal spectacle that is being fought. Now, I can predict confidently that with COP20 in Paris, the same sort of politicized and active controversies as we've seen in the past will emerge again. This is precisely an illustration of how the political has now been banned, quite literally banned, excluded from the theaters of techno-managerial governance, precisely because the confines, the framework within which the techno-managerial dispositif is negotiated cannot be questioned. There is no radical political imaginary possible that is open for contestation within the auditoria and the meeting rooms of the COP meetings. Therefore, those who radically oppose the still ongoing commodification of the climate, take the Kyoto Protocol, the various offsetting schemes as the only means we have really on a global level to mitigate the climate change, is precisely articulated around the consensually established view that neoliberal market mechanisms are the only way of doing so. For those who disagree, they cannot be incorporated within the techno-managerial negotiations. They are literally put in the streets. That's why we see those who have a different imaginary of how to organize, how to produce the climate, both locally as well as globally, are relegated to the public domain of the street. And that is where politicization begins to happen. Potentially, whether it will lead to something that I do not know. So, but what we do quite clearly see is that today the democratic, emancipatory political act first takes place at a distance from the post-political dispositives of governance. And this is a form of governance that is where you have private organizations, civil society organizations, and states at a variety of geographical scales, including quasi-states such as the European Union, negotiate within a given frame on the one hand, and then those who disagree and want to change the very architecture on how to produce the environment, in this case, the climate. They are relegated to a spatiality outside of the state. So the political today, for me, emerges, as Miguel Abensur argued a few years ago, at a distance from the state. Secondly, in its appearance at a distance from the state, it's nonetheless an appearance in public spaces. And that's where I will begin to link it to the urban condition. For me, the re-emergence of the political in post-political times is a decidedly urban process. And yes, so for me, the political is articulated with publicity. So in the same, so while it unfolds within public space, in the process of the politicizing act, it creates, or if successful at least, it creates a new form of publicity. It is a publicity that interrupts the given order of things. That's why these politicizing expressions, these outbursts, if you want, these insurgencies almost invariably meet with either the discursive and sometimes the real violence of the state. And that is one of the real issues, to the extent that politicization is taking place at a distance from the configuration of governance, it automatically opens up a quite complex, contradictory, and occasionally violent encounter between the two. What it also does is it shifts the terrain of framing what is at stake. For 20 years, the environmental movements, the environmental social movements have not very successfully mobilized these tactics of organizing through public space in an attempt to influence, force, reshape the existing post-political frame of techno-managerial governance. They have not been very successful at doing so, despite the extraordinary political and other energies that have been mobilized in trying to push the agenda or open the agenda up to force at least an other possibility or a set of other possibilities within the existing frame. That proved to be impossible. They all did so, of course, with an eye towards and on the basis of legitimizing what they were doing in the name of nature, the climate in this case, or biodiversity, or whatever, in the name of an external nature. Today, since the magical year 2011, that has changed. I think what we have witnessed over the past 4 or 5 years, and the global financial crisis has helped to shape that in certain way, is that these original social movements, many of whom articulated around environmental issues, have now begun to act as politicizing movements. Take, as just one example, the heroic struggle of at least some Turkish people about a year ago on Taksim Square. You may recall what the quilting point, the point de capitaine was, around which this extraordinary outburst of discontent was. It was about a few trees and a park, and the attempt by the state to erase that from the park and to construct some sort of pseudo-architectural shopping mall. So this very local, everyday, but decidedly physical, environmental, biological condition became the quilting point that nonetheless quickly translated into a universalizing demand for democratizing change, for democratizing transformation. Now, such politicizing democratic transformation shifts the terrain not just from a particular object to an emancipatory demand, but also it shifts the terrain of action. The classic environmental social movement expresses its demands, just reducing CO2, for example, for climate change, to the elites. Please Obama, please Roland, please Cameron, the situation is really dramatic. Please do initiate the technical, managerial, and other mechanisms that will bring CO2 emissions down and fulfill our dream and aspiration for a socially more just and ecologically more sane world. So it's based on the assumption that the elites are there and that they can answer the call of movements to change. That is what social environmental movements do. Political environmental movements, in contrast, say, we have no demands. There is nothing that we want that you, the elites, can offer. In order to achieve what we want, a democratizing change, the political configuration has to transform. That is, the frame itself has to change. The frame itself has to shift. Now, this may sound like a call for a big revolutionary change. It is actually not. Not at all. It is a call expressed by these politicizing movements for a slight shift in perspective. From a slight shift in perspective that may have very important consequences. It basically says the existing post-political neoliberal consensus is a continuing recipe for disaster. It's only if you begin to slightly reorient this framework that we might begin to have more effective, democratic and inclusive means to produce a different sort of world. Now, this construction of a new world has to be a decidedly urban project. Not just for the very simple reason that today most people live in cities. I mean, that's obvious, and the United Nations predict that very soon 70% of the world's population will live in cities. But that's not the main issue. The main issue is that the current process of neoliberal globalization finds its geographical and ecological expression precisely in the process of urbanization. A process of urbanization that has become fully and completely globalized. Take, for example, this mobile phone, celebrated both by activists as the means to organize, as well as by smart city and sustainable city pundits as what is going to save the ecological conundrum of cities. Now, every single one of these things, and most of us buy a new one every 2 years or so, every piece of IT equipment upon which our everyday so-called post-material life rests has coltan in it. Coltan is a rare earth of which the highest concentration can be found in the mines around the Great Lakes in Africa. And you and I know what an extraordinary socio-ecological catastrophe is, has been unfolding and continues to unfold along the Great Lakes. So each time we buy a new iPhone 5, 6, 7, or 8, we are actually actively nurturing the very process of combined and uneven socio-ecological apocalypse that shapes, maintains, and structures the process of urbanization today, whether it's Paris or London, New York or Tokyo. And of course, when I throw this away, actually I do not throw this away. I want to keep my environmental soul white. So I take it to the recycling center, of course, for recycling. And we all know where the recycling of this thing happens. That happens in the slums of Delhi, Mumbai, and Dhaka under extraordinarily perverse socio-ecological conditions where we have the fusion of the most perverse forms of social and economic exclusion, marginalization, and poverty combined with the extraordinary physical and ecological degradation of the life world of where those people are in. And here we're coming at the crux of what is radically disavowed by the dominant environmental policy framework that articulates around techno-managerial dispositives, very often in an urban context, right? Let's have sustainable buildings. Let's have smart networks in order to reduce the CO2 output of our buildings or heating systems, etc. Let's not forget that the very production of these eco-technical monsters are predicated upon sustaining a combined and uneven socio-ecological apocalypse at a world scale. And it's only at the moment that we as academics, researchers, begin to recognize how everyday the practices are inserted within socio-physical configurations and networks that embody decidedly uneven and unequal social political power relationships, we will never be able to really politicize the ecological and environmental condition that we're in. And again, it's precisely this it's precisely this what the politicizing urban movements, such as those that we've seen in Istanbul, and such as those that are today unfolding in cities like Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo. Today is the opening day of the World Soccer Championships, and at the same time, people in the city, in the streets of Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro are protesting and fighting around the socio-ecological catastrophe that is animated and managed through precisely these great spectacles, whose mission is precisely to further reinforce the competitive position of Rio de Janeiro, Sao Paulo, and the Brazilian economy. Yes, that's of course vitally important question, which revolves around three interrelated issues, I think. The first one is that scientists should be much more careful in articulating the relationship between matters of fact, which most scientists would consider to be their domain, that is the construction of facts, and through that truth on the one hand, and what Bruno Latour would call matters of concern. In most of the cases that I know, scientists tend to translate matters of fact into matters of concern without proper political intermediation. That's number one. Let me give you an example of this. In the previous IPCC report, which was the first one that looked at the social consequences, human consequences of climate change, the report said, not surprisingly, that the poor, the world's poor, will be hit first and hardest by climate change, which I think is a pretty trivial observation, because that's the very definition of poverty, that one is hit hard and first in the face of conditions that one does not control. So in that sense, a fairly trivial observation per se in itself. And then concluded, therefore, the report said, we have to do something about climate change, which I thought was a very strange mobilization of logic, right? You could equally logically say, therefore, we have to do something about the structural condition of exclusion and poverty, so that people are better weaponed against the unforeseen and difficult conditions they're going to face. So that is what I mean by a politically non-mediated translation from the position of the neutral scientist to the position of the engaged scientist, the engaged public. So that is, so in sum, a much greater politicized articulation needs to be established between matters of fact and their translation into matters of concern. That's number one. Number two is, and that is particularly strong in environmental sciences, is the duplicity of the scientist. And I think that has to be rendered much more explicit. Duplicity which can be summarized as follows. On the one hand, they insist on the neutral content of the facts. On the other hand, they feel, quite rightly so, that it should have an impact, that their science should have some sort of use. The consequence of this strange fusion of an insistence of fact and desire to be useful overwhelmingly leads to the formulation of scientific, quote unquote, but highly ideological as far as I am concerned, proposals, visions, and suggestions that fit within the existing frame, rather than suggestions that are politicizing, that destabilize the existing frame. So most of the work that's being done by the majority of environmental scientists is inherently reactionary, although often formulated under the guise of radical change, of innovation or creativity. It is aimed at addressing a problem that is defined in technical, objective, scientific terms, and in doing so, they radically disavow, marginalize, repress the political element in it. The classic example here is economics, of course, right? For the economists, the mainstream economists today, there's only one world possible. It's a one world that's organized along very specific principles of organizing socio-ecological change. That is commodification and market exchange, which has become a naturalized dogma. And many of the environmental scientists fit into that. The third element refers then to what should we do? What should we do? Well, I'm personally involved in a European Union funded project on environmental conflict, environmental struggle, and the politicization of environmental conflict. It funds 12 doctoral students and their projects and 4 postdocs. It's organized as a consortium between 7 or 8 universities, mine included, and 5 or 6 civil society organizations. Every single one of the projects that are unfolding within this framework, it's called Untitled, is organized as an activist researcher project. So our researchers are actively involved as activists alongside the others that struggle in the particular configuration of the environmental conflict, and through that articulate these politicizing struggles with new theoretical insights about what politics is. For example, one of our colleagues, collaborators, works around gold mining in Romania. You may have heard of this extraordinary public mobilization against the plans for the great gold mining exercise in Rosa, Montana. And our colleague is both actively involved in this environmental struggle, and through her active involvement in articulation with the kind of theoretical arguments that I've been exploring here, is trying to engage with these movements in an attempt to move the focus slightly from the mere ecological condition of gold mining, which in itself quite important, to a democratizing struggle, a struggle that asks questions about who has the right to decide what kind of socio-ecological world we want to inhabit. And all of the 15 projects are doing so. So this is, I think, one of the possible way forwards. I do not know, of course, what equality is, but those who fight know precisely what it is. It's not up to me as a critical sociologist, social scientist, ecologist to decide what equality is. Those who fight for equality know precisely what it is, and in the act, the politicizing act, actually define what that equality is. What we can do as intellectuals is articulate with that, and through this process jointly give a voice and a name to this struggle. Yes, it's actually quite easy these days to find extraordinary examples of how scientific work and political activation can fuse together. Particularly since 2008, 2009, and I'm going to speak about Europe for the time being. In 2011, 2012, we've seen in the Mediterranean elsewhere these gigantic outbursts of discontent, where people at the same time expressed their extraordinary discontent with the existing political and economic configurations, and were at the same time calling for a different constituent order, a different world, a different way of organizing the commons of life in a democratic, free, and solidarity-based way. Now, these expressions of discontent seem to have died out in the sense they're not any longer prominently in the media. But if you go to places like Spain, Greece, and many, many others, we see today an extraordinary proliferation of all manner of new, different, alternative ways of collectively organizing socio-ecological life. We are ourselves heavily involved in trying to think through with them what these practices are, to what extent they constitute an alternative, how these practices can become part of a process of politicization. So, for example, in the case of Spain, we had elections, European elections a few weeks ago. One party, Podemos, which is directly articulated with the Indignado movement and which is very heavily linked with those myriad of socio-ecological and socio-economic alternatives and initiatives that are dotting the Spanish landscape, got 8–9% of the vote, have 5 or 6 representatives in the European Parliament. Now, these are extraordinary new signs of new forms of politicization in which I think intellectuals and scientists have a very important role to play, to think with them how they can organize, what they mean, how they're different, how they can be nurtured, and how these localized experiments can be turned into more universalizing, transformative processes and tactics. That is the sort of positive forms of mobilizations that I see, and where I think an extraordinary space for new scientific research, both by natural scientists. There is an extraordinary demand for knowledge, for information, as well as the research by social scientists and humanities. And for the latter, what I think is missing is a name for our desire. And I think that is what is still absent, lacking. If there is a lack today, it's not a politicizing action. There's plenty of that. There is no shortage of people who say, we want something else. What we have is not working, not economically, not socially, and certainly not ecologically. We never had, I would argue, so many people who are deeply convinced that what we have needs to change. They begin to imagine ways of organizing life in common, ecologically and socially, differently. But we don't have a name for that desire. The only names for an alternative politics that exists today articulates around questions of identity, nationalism, regionalism, etc. We do not have a name for a political name for the emancipatory and ecologically more sane future that we would like to inhabit. And that is a great challenge for ecological and environmental humanities. What is it we want? And what is the name that can give content to the desire that is expressed in these proliferating, politicizing struggles that we talked about earlier? What the future holds, I don't know, but I find it helpful to turn the old Gramscian argument upside down. You recall that Gramsci, one of his great statements was the optimism of the will and the pessimism of the intellect. I think today we have precisely the reverse situation, which is the optimism of the mind, we can imagine all sorts of differences and alternatives. We were actively invited to be who we want to be. That is the great promise of neoliberal cosmopolitan capitalism. You know, imagine who you want to be, just dream it. So there's extraordinary optimism of the intellect, but at the same time an extraordinary pessimism of the will. And by that I mean that so many of those who are actively fighting for a different world do not really believe that it can come about. And that is one of the great challenges for the future. I think the only hope for a democratic transformation is that we really begin to believe what our will to act seems to suggest. And that is the greatest challenge, to really believe in the truth of the possibility of an other world. Whether that will happen, I do not know. What I do know that the obstacles on such a trajectory are formidable. We do know from history that at the moment that an emancipatory, democratizing, inclusive political mobilization becomes more successful, it is invariably, has to invariably face the violence of those who want to make sure that nothing really changes. And that will be one of the great challenges we will have to face. Also have to accept that if nothing fundamentally changes, the world is not going to come to an end in an ecological Armageddon, in the ecological apocalypse that is continuously promised. What we do know, if the political and economic situation does not change, that it will be, and that it is, the socio-ecological Armageddon and apocalypse for some, in some places, and not for others in other places. I'll leave it with that. Thank you.